presentation. I will try to be not too much apocalyptic. And I will talk about the question of automation, automatization. The title of my lecture is Automatic Society. In a book entitled What Makes Life Worth Living in Pharmacology, recently published in English translation by Politic Press, I have tried to show why the question of posthumanism is not a question, or at least not a consistent philosophical question. If it is true that philosophy is above all a discourse on what the question is, or if one prefers to dispense with the question of being, of essence, on what makes a question. Since then, I have devoted time to working on the new prospects and possibilities opened up by the neurosciences. And this had led me to the question of the relation between autonomy, psychobiological automatisms, technological automatisms, and regression. Ours is an age of widespread and general automation and automatization. This is a context that leads some to believe we should refer to posthumanism. At the horizon of automatization are projected the figures of the cyborg and the golem, to the extent that biological automatisms and psychic automatisms are rearranged by and with technological automata. These rearrangements make it seem that the process of hominization that has taken place over the last 2 million years, and which we can understand as a process of externalization, has, if not turned against itself, at least turned in on itself. Technology is less and less what exteriorizes itself. Technology is increasingly that which is internalized. Today, when we refer to enhancement, it is less a matter of adding supplementary organs to the human body than it is a question of modifying and transforming the organs that constitute the psychosomatic body by technologically redesigning them from the inside so as to make this interior that one used to refer to as the soul compatible with control by robotic peripheral devices. This is currently being done, for example, to assist those suffering from hemiplegia. But here we are also talking about creating a compatibility with systems for the automated control of these souls themselves by submitting them to the kinds of social technical systems devoted to tracking and tracing that are presently being installed everywhere via generalized digitalization. All this may be true. Nevertheless, to refer this to posthumanism is to pass over a prior question, which is that of the relation between autonomy and automatism, which is also to say between autonomy and heteronomy. It is to dispense in the name of humanism with any reconsideration to the heteronomic conditions, that is, the technical conditions of autonomy. fact, all this must be comprehensively revisited. And it is also to ignore the questions, both economic and political, that these heteronomic conditions insistently raise. And to do so at the very moment that generalized automatization is clearly bringing about a new age of heteronomy. In general, the relation between autonomy and heteronomy should be understood not as an opposition, but as a competition. In saying this, I'm raising a theme that I discussed in terms of political economy in the decadence of industrial democracies. To fail to do so would be to posit the inevitability of a post-human fate, a fate in which autonomy, conceived thus as pure interiority, would be lost in the heteronomization in which the internalization of artificial organs, now becoming automata, would consist. In fact, however, autonomy is always and specifically constituted as the internalization of heteronomic artifactuality. The question of the posthuman attempts to raise the possibility that any possibility of questioning might be closed off forever. But aside from the fact that this question was already posed by Plato at the question of the pharmacon, and by Karl Marx at the question of the proletarians, such a possibility is only a possibility insofar as it composes with another possibility, failing which it would not be a possibility at all, but rather the end of any possibility, the result of which would be a determinism where nothing is possible other than its own auto-fulfillment. There is another possibility. There is an alternative, which is that the age of generalized automatization could constitute a new age of autonomy, the conception of which would derive from a redefinition of past, present, and future autonomy, and as a relation to heteronomy that composes with it in a therapeutic manner, and not a toxic manner. If autonomy must be understood as a capacity to intensify the possibilities of individuation, and if, as I have long argued by relying on Gilbert Simondon, a French philosopher, psychic individuation is possible only on the condition that it contributes to and participates in collective individuation and technical individuation, then technical heteronomy, far from being the opposite of individuating autonomy, on the contrary, contributes to its development. This constitutes the horizon of the free software movement, for example, the thought behind the work of André Gorz on work and the possibility of an economy of contribution. Before arguing these points in more detail, I must return to the question of post-humanism. The latter could be posited by or impose itself upon a way of thinking that can be called philosophical only to the extent that we accept that the question of humanism has been correctly posed. But I have myself always rejected the humanist way of questioning, which means the way of questioning that posits that the question of philosophy is, above all, the question of man, of the human. My rejection is not quite the same as Heidegger's, who rejects it in the name of the question of being, so that the question of man becomes radically secondary. I reject it because it is an obstacle, for reasons that clearly intersect with those invoked by Heidegger from the side of the question of being. It is an obstacle to thinking the question of techniques, and more particularly, techniques are the inhuman that continually, always and forever puts the human into question, that is, into possibilities, and puts in question the question of man itself. Immanuel Kant, to whom I always try to stay as close as possible, there comes a point at which this is no longer possible. And this is the point at which I try to do my own philosophy. Kant erected to philosophical rank the question, what is man? If he did so, it was because he was not himself able to pose the question of the schematism in the way required to provide what Jacques Derrida called a logic and a history of the supplement. That is, a thinking of iterability and therefore of repetition that can grant a difference, namely as the projective possibility of a pharmacological field and a schema, a projective apparatus, that brings the best and the worst, not the best or worst of human beings. It should be noted in passing. Whatever may be the case for Kant, Dasein in sein Unzeit does not pose the question of the human, but the question of being through the existence of this being who can question being, and who is Dasein rather than the human, and not just rather than the human, but before the human, earlier than the human. The question of being, which is the question of this privilege of Dasein insofar as in being the being who questions, it can inscribe a difference between being and beings, in being and in beings. A difference that is the time of being, and the being of time as epochality, that is Geschichtlichkeit. It is not because Heidegger rejects the question of the human, despite what the existence of analytics seems to suggest, which will fool Sartre, that I myself dispute its philosophical necessity, but because, contrary to what Heidegger says, what makes this question possible, which is furthermore always also the question of the possible and of its conditions of impossibility, as Derrida liked to say, and what puts in question the human itself, and that so by showing that the question is never just that of the human, is techniques. What I'm talking about here, however, is no longer just a question concerning technology. Techniques, that is not a question that posits itself to the being who questions, but that puts this being into question. It is the condition of any question. And in this respect, I do not believe that Heidegger truly grasped the question concerning technology in terms of the radicality of its questioning. Even if I even if what he called unconcealment holds only on this condition. Heidegger was incapable of thinking this because he rejected the question of what I have proposed calling tertiary retention in order to rethink what he himself called Weltgeschichtlichkeit, or tertiary intention is also, if you want, mnemotechnics. I apologize for having to recall these questions that I raised at the end of Techniques and Time, first volume, The Fall of Prometheus. I'm forced to do so because they constitute the grounds on the basis of which I want to investigate our own age in terms of a condition that automatically puts us into question, at the risk of interrupting all possibility of question. This is the catastrophe. What posthumanism lacks is the primordial question of proletarianization. That is, the question of a primordial proletarianization, which is that of the pharmacon, and which is first formulated by Plato as the question of hypomnesis. Hypomnesis puts into question the being that we ourselves are, insofar as we are the being who questions. It is that which can always come to interrupt anamnesis, which is the name Socrates gives to what Heidegger calls questioning. I've argued that this interruption is a technological epoche, and that this epoche always has two stages. The stage of putting into question and the stage of the formation, idea, Bildung, of this question as the constitution and transmission of a circuit of trans-individuation through which an understanding of being there, Dasein, in its being is established. And that is the constantly forgotten condition of all positively constituted knowledge. Positively constituted knowledge is anamnesic, that is autonomous, discovering its own law in itself, and as the inaugural possibility of thinking for oneself. But if it arises from out of the heteronomic interruption by hypomnesis, and more generally from an artifactuality that puts into question, this anamnesic and autonomous knowledge finds its power in the ability to turn a moment of disindividuation, of interruption, of putting into question, of challenge, into a promise of individuation, a quantum leap in individuation, as Simonon says, and of doing so through the adoption of technological epochal power and its transformation into psycho-social and socio-technical epochal power. We are challenged by techniques, and techniques is itself a process of individuation that both supports and threatens psychic and collective individuation, and that supports it through that which threatens it. Technical individuation requires the psychic and social individual that it threatens. And this is a primordial pharmacological situation. Simonon taught us that the psychic individual can individuate itself only by contributing to a collective individuation. But the passage from the psychic to the collective which engenders the trans-individual is possible only with the support of that hypomnesic milieu that is the technical milieu associated with psychic and social individuals. This associated milieu is composed of artificial organs and the threefold process of individuation that constitutes the becoming of the pharmacological beings that we try to be by becoming what we are, by individuating ourselves, must be conceived on the basis of general organology, where the three strands of the individuation of technical life, always simultaneously arranging the three processes of psychic, collective, and technical individuation, are three inseparable organological modalities: psychosomatic organs, artificial organs, and social organizations. These days it is tempting to get caught up in the question of post-humanism because the artifactual sphere that is constituted by technical individuation does tend to operate as a process of total automatization, reflected in the figure of the robot. The stage of total automatization is the more recent stage of a process of grammatization, that is, of the discretization and technical reproduction of human fluxes and flows, of which writing, that is Plato's pharmakon, is one stage. The machine tool is another stage, one founded on Vaucanson's automata, and where the digital is the extension of these to every sphere of existence. In all human societies that currently subsist, the question being to know if societies, in the sense of collective individuation, processes, can survive such a process of automatization. The question of posthumanism avoids is that of the politico-economic choices that are opened up in the epoch of automated man, that is, in the age where the human being lives in an automatically administered society. Big data is the example of this. Such a question, which presupposes a new critique of political economy, for which I have previously argued in a book entitled For a New Critique of Political Economy, must firstly and profoundly revisit the question of the relation of life to automatism in all its dimensions, and in particular in the so-called human field, insofar as this is inclusive of technological automatisms, psychic automatisms, and biological automatisms, whereas in the animal field, automatism presents itself spontaneously as instinct. Automatism repeats, and if it is true that technical life is no longer governed by instincts, but by drugs, then to think automatic repetition, we must refer to Freud's discoveries in 1920. Discoveries which, passing through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, constituted the ground of Deleuze's meditation on the relation between difference and repetition, where the automatism of repetition, or repetition as the condition of possibility of all automatism, is presented essentially as a pharmacological question. Deleuze would prefer to say a problem, for, I quote Deleuze, if we die of repetition, we are also saved and healed by it. held above all by the other repetition. The whole mystical game of loss and salvation is therefore contained in repetition, along with the whole theatrical game of life and death, and the whole positive game of illness and health. Unquote. That what Deleuze sees as repetition, however, is capable of producing a difference, that is, an individuation, as well as a baseness, which is when we disindividuate. This means that this repetition presupposes technical externalization, that is, dramatization as a possibility of a repetition that is neither biological nor psychic, via the hypomnesic and pharmacological support of repetition that grants a difference. That is, an individuation and a difference with an A in the sense of Derrida, as well as a baseness, that is, an indifference and a disindividuation, in what Gilbert Simondon and Gilles Deleuze also describe as an interindividuality, whereby the transindividual loses meaning, being no longer a pre-individual potential for individuation, but merely a formal signification through which the group regresses and falls into baseness. In the 19th century, dramatization, which is the technical history of the repetition of discretized mental and behavioral flows that are in this sense dramatized, which is the history of the technical power of repetition. In 19th century, dramatization leads to automation, as it was described by Marx in the Grundrisse, and this constitutes a turning point in the history of repetition, given that today, in industrial capitalism, economic development will occur only on the condition of putting bad repetition to work. Bad repetition in the sense of Gilles Deleuze, that is, by implementing the kinds of repetition that result in baseness and indifference, or, if you prefer, entropy. This is the historical background constituted by man insofar as he is a technician that leads him to produce robots, man-made creatures, beings created by man and endowed with autonomy, creations of the human technician who might therefore produce what in Blade Runner we called replicants, but where the golem of the Talmud, of Sefer Yetzirah, or of Yehuda Leib already supplied the basis of the notion. The robot and the industrial realization of the golem amounts to an exit from the human being of the history of hominization. That is, it is an exit from life insofar as it is characterized by its technicization as a process of exteriorization, enabling the putting in question of the questioned and questioning being, thanks to the very fact that it exteriorizes itself. To be put outside oneself either makes you furious, in English as in French, to be beside oneself is above all to be furious. To lose composure, to lose control, to give in, if not to the instincts, that then at least to the drives, or makes you dependent, alienated, subjected, and disindividuated. In our own epoch, this exteriorization leads to what proves to be a process of internalization rather than externalization, a process sometimes described as the convergence of nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science. It is justifiable to argue that if this situation does not insert us into the question of posthumanism, we are nevertheless indeed confronted with the question of a turning point, of a radical change of trajectory in that process which across 2 million years will have constituted technical life in Georges Canguilhem's sense, a turn, the result of which will be a new epoch of life. Life has had many epochs. The epoch of bacteria, of archaea, of protists and other single-celled eukaryotes, right up to the aggregations of cells and organs that we are ourselves. Ourselves, that is, these multicellular beings who cannot do without non-living organs, artifacts, prostheses, and eventually today, automata. As I prepared for this conference, for example, I searched among the masses of tertiary retentions of mnemotechnics, of mnemotechnical products that are mnemotechnical traces that we living technicians have produced for 2 million years and organized in the form of knowledge in order to find out about archaea using Google and then Wikipedia, the latter being a collaborative site, although what we usually forget is that it also relies a great deal on so-called bots, which is an abbreviation for robots, when by the latter we mean logical and algorithmic automata that are, I quote Wikipedia itself, mainly used to perform repetitive tasks that automation allows to be performed at high speed, unquote. The differentiation of the living unfolds from the parthenogenesis of single-celled organisms right up to the higher vertebrates such as ourselves, endowed with both an endoskeleton and an exoskeleton, and surrounded by the exoorganism and organization that are human societies, producing a collective individuation founded on artificial organs, and passing along the way through the sexuation of multicellular bodies lacking a nervous system such as plants, through invertebrate animals protected by an exoskeleton such as the snail, the crab, the insect, and so on. Today, long after technical organs first appeared, this differentiation of the living has led to the automatic differentiation of the non-living. The production of organs and organizations where the difference between organic and inorganic is blurred in becoming industrial at the cost of an indifferentiation of life, that is, its decline, a loss of biodiversity as much as of cultural diversity. At each step of this history of the struggle of negantropy against the entropy that results from its becoming technical, and it is perhaps precisely this that defines the pharmacological, in other words, to be Janus-like, to have one phase that is negantropic and another that is entropic. At each step of this history, with every step of this history, then, each epoch of life implements new conditions of automatic repetition in which differences are produced, differences that we generally relate to forms of autonomy, of the psyche defined by Aristotle as having three types, and as self-movement in autopoiesis in the theory of inaction, and passing through thinking as dialogue with oneself according to Plato, or the conquest of majority, maturity, Mündigkeit in the Kantian sense. But in order to understand what we are, and on the way to which we will have been on the way for at least 2 million years, or 4 million years, if we believe the World War, and in order to understand it correctly, all this must be thought with the concepts of mineral, vital, and psychosocial individuation. Psychosocial individuation is the second epoch of automatism. There is no mineral automatism. And this is why Georges Canguilhem can claim that there are no mineral monsters. When life reproduces itself, it repeats life in an automatic way. But within vital reproduction, there can be deviations that we can call monsters, insofar as they do not automatically repeat the schema of the organic form that is reproducing itself. And this is what cannot happen to a crystal, to a mineral individuation. The advent of psychosocial individuation, however, will in turn eventually lead to a generalized industrial automatization founded on automation such as it began in the 19th century with the fact described by Andrew Urey and cited by Marx as, I quote, a vast automaton. A new epoch of psychic and collective individuation thus emerges, which would perhaps take us not into a post-humanist process, because humanism as a question of knowing what man is not a true question. If it is true that man is the one who individuates himself with techniques such that he constantly becomes other, and such that the human adopts the inhuman or becomes inhuman, from not reaching the point of humanness and from failing to adapt himself by individuating himself, that is, from a failure to think and to realize this thought correctly, concretely. So the question would not be a post-humanist process, but rather an inversion of exteriorization where it becomes interiorization, such that this technical internalization seems to induce a psychic disinteriorization. There is no exteriorization without interiorization, except in the case of proletarianization, the precise goal of which is to submit the proletarianized to an exteriorization of its knowledge without the need for re-internalizing what has been exteriorized. Today, neuroscience provides new evidence in relation to these questions. When we see how neuroeconomics applies this evidence, we can better grasp how significant are the stakes of what I believe we should describe as the age of generalized automatization. Generalized automatization is what leads to the industrial development of a kind of robotics, which constitutes, through ambient computing, a robotized living space, which means that there is gradually less and less left for me to do. I no longer need to open doors, order groceries, and so on, drive my car. And means that I gradually lose all my savoir-faire and savoir-vivre, my knowledge of how to do things and how to live. What I want to look at today are those bots, to which I refer here by citing the Wikipedia entry devoted to them, and where on Wikipedia itself, for example, such bots format the work of contributors, that we are, contributors like you and I, who, when we do not content ourselves with reading entries, sometimes correct them or even create them. Here a certain amount of individual and collective autonomy is made possible by a technological and automatic heteronomy. I will return to this for my conclusion. Wikipedia is a space of trans-individuation assisted by logical and linguistic automata. A space that shows how an automated trans-individuation can serve an automatized trans-individuation, if I may put it like that. Automatized trans-individuation designating then what used to be called sovereignty. Bots, however, presuppose an ensemble of apparatus to track and produce metadata, also involving RFID systems, and an infrastructure of generalized automatization that should be described in detail. All this amounting to what Christian Faure entitled the transfer industry, which is on the way to changing the face of the human world, which could become the human non-world, l'immonde, we say in French, the catastrophe. All this, which also involves the so-called Internet of Things, machine-to-machine or device-to-device communication, all this, which is still little known and largely underestimated, constitutes the industrial infrastructures of a new apparatus of reading and writing, not only between human beings, but also between robots and automated apparatus on the one hand, and humans on the other hand. The humans communicating between themselves via these bots and automata. This is what makes it possible to scan groups with these data analysis technologies that these automata are above all, and through that it becomes possible to anticipate and create behavior. For example, with those user profiling systems and big data that everyone now knows about, and with performative effects in real-time big data processing. One of the issues here is to know how all this is articulated with psychic automatisms via the technologies emerging from neuromarketing. Without bots, Wikipedia would not work properly. And these bots, in turn, can themselves function only via the contribution of psychic individuals and collective individuals who develop through this, or at least some of them do, forms of knowledge, that is, perspectives of the autonomous world. Perhaps these foreshadows new forms of knowledge, though that should form the heart of digital studies, that is, of the organological study of the knowledge and thought of man in the epoch of digital tertiary retention. Studies that should not ignore scholars and contributors belonging to a much wider sphere than just those connected to so-called ubiquitous human computing. The latter consisting in making people do computer-based piecework and exploiting them through a process of decentralized proletarianization in what amount to networked factories where they perform tasks that are highly automated and which require psychic and not just technological automatisms. Here the outlines of an alternative begin to appear. In automatic society, technological automatisms can be made to serve either an elevation and a transformation of psychic automatisms in a new age of the libido sciendi, and more generally of the idealization and sublimation processes that are always potentially entailed by any process of formalization and knowledge, or a regressive exploitation of those psychic automatisms that are the drives and archaic behaviors concealed within the so-called reptilian brain, which technological automatisms are, under the guidance of neuromarketing and neuroeconomics, able to solicit by bypassing and short-circuiting the cortical zones dedicated to the internalization of knowledge, that is, to the constitution of capacities founded on anamnesic processes of adoption of the hypomnesic possibilities proper to any particular stage of dramatization. Such would be the tasks of what we could call a philosophy of lifetime, of its shadows and its numbers, where automatization is on the dark side of the numerical as much as it is a new stage and a new age of enlightenment, and where automatization as a social and scholarly project as much as an industrial project would lead to a complete renegotiation of the question of work, where the delegation of those tasks constituting employment or jobs to automata is completely ignored. Within such a project, those automatisms that are realized concretely by robots would still make possible the delegation of functions that were previously performed by human beings, but only on the basis of a complete rethinking of the social project, and where the acquisition and formation of new forms of knowledge and new capabilities in Amartya sense of the term becomes the main way that work is remunerated, such work being no longer just a job. Here we would need to devote time to examining the proposals of André Gorz and Oscar Necht, but unfortunately there is no time for this. We cannot investigate any deeper into these questions without asking what it is in these various automatisms. And there are automatisms of exteriorization, technological automatisms, and automatisms of interiorization, psychic automatisms. That means that processes of internalizing technological automatisms deriving from exteriorization can produce psychic and technical automatisms of a singular type in relation to purely machine-based or drive-based automatisms. Automatism or automata in Vaucanson's sense, automata as a technical object endowed with a relatively autonomous movement, we may refer in general terms to the autonomy that the battery, for example, gives to the computer. For example, my own device has 12 hours of battery life. Allows the reproduction of one or more operational sequences, that is, or one or many movements, and it is this that can take the place of a temporal sequence of human movements. In addition to the technological automatism that currently pervades the world in all its dimensions, there is an automatism of the drives. In this case, automatism presents itself as a symptomatic automatic behaviors, and more generally as psychosomatic phenomena. Something moves me, affects me, and I blush, or I blench. I turn red, or I turn white. These are automatisms of my body. Or again, anxiety causes obsessional automatic behaviors, which indeed form a compromise between consciousness and the unconscious. The id being a space of automatisms deriving from both consciousness and the unconscious. The whole issue of the id is there according to Freud himself. My obsessional and as such automatic behavior indicates to everyone who sees it, except myself, to myself, that something is not right. Such behavior allows me to hide from myself that something is wrong, to repress it, preventing me from expressing it to myself while still letting me express myself, but in the form of automatisms, that is, by default and without seeing it, unconsciously, I would say. Such automatisms of the unconscious and the id, which are not those of the drives, but defense mechanisms against drive-based automatisms, are pathological in the sense that they produce a pathos, an emotion, an alteration that represents what I call a trauma type, and that engenders very specific stereotypes, memory being constituted from retentions that are themselves organized by synchronizing stereotypes that contain diachronizing trauma types. The stereotypes of neurotics do in certain situations mean that they constantly repeat the same behaviors. And here we are brought back to Deleuze, who explored beyond the pleasure principle, because they contain a trauma type that they thus prevent from manifesting itself, that is, in an autonomous way. To develop this point, it would be necessary to pass through Derrida's archive fever, mal d'archive in French, where he refers to an archive drive, that is, a drive to exteriorize, a hypomnesic drive, producing what I call tertiary retentions, that is, mnemotechnical retentions. I believe that this Derridian discourse on the relations between the drive and the archive, relations that constitute the crux of both technological and psychological automatisms, is, however, ill-founded. Archive fever interprets badly, gives a bad interpretation of those archives that are the Freudian Derrida's archive fever is in many ways an extraordinary book, reopening the question first opened in 1962 with The Origin of Geometry by Husserl, and continued in 1966 with Freud and the Scene of Writing, in 1967 with Speech and Phenomena, and in 1966 with Of Grammatology. Archive Fever, which was published in 1995, reopens the whole question of hypomnesis that is not formulated as such under this name and as a question of the pharmacon until 1972 in Plato's Pharmacy. Archive Fever is the first true Derridian product of the history of the supplement that he promised in 1968 on grammatology. This work constitutes, in a way, the psychoanalytic and Freudian prolegomena to a true history of the supplement, that is of the prosthesis, that is of the automaton, where Derrida asks in a long preface what would have become of Freud in an epoch where email circulates at the speed of light, and what would have become of psychoanalysis. By questioning along these lines, Derrida gives great weight to what I call tertiary retention. And this is what I myself am trying to do. This leads him to say that the psychic apparatus is transformed by tertiary retention. That is, by techniques. In saying this, Derrida, who nearly 20 years ago is already writing about the consequences of digital and industrial tertiary retention, is extremely clear-sighted. He sees, coming from a great distance, those elements that will put us in question, will challenge and confront us in the pharmacology of the question, presupposed by this challenge, by the technology of the question, and in relation to which he tries to create an anamnesic return of this putting in question through the hypomnesic return begun in 1962 and formulated as such in 1972. This return being a kind of anamnesis in 1995 of his own journey, which also happens to be the year of Deleuze, and the year that Deleuze committed suicide. It is necessary here to consider 2 points that, due to time constraints, I will mention here, only to leave them aside from another time. Can we finish now? Yes. On the one hand, the pharmacological question and challenge of and by the archive drive, that is the drive to exteriorize, necessarily passes through Nietzsche and through his will to power. On the other hand, the archive as exteriorization is what puts into question Derrida's way of posing the question of this archive drive, that is, the way in which he relates it to the death drive. Not that I disagree that we should relate the archive drive to the death drive, but because Derrida does not conceive the death drive correctly. He posits that the death drive is opposed to the pleasure principle, which is an astonishing counter-reading of the Freudian archive and of the Freudian question of the archive, such as it constitutes noetic life as archivization, that is, as technical life. Whatever it forms, life, which is defined by its reproductive capacity, in some way auto-archives itself, either under the pressure of Darwinian biological evolution or from an evolution of technological forms, the archive itself as what is exteriorized, deposited and or sedimented, forming a technical milieu that is the condition of noetic life. The reaction of archivarization to technical life is an essential effect of the technicization of the life, that is, the noetic soul. To think in this way is to think the birth of desire as a capacity for projection and exteriorization, for the expression and impression of the soul as the arrangement of automatisms and autonomisms, desire being what transforms, drive-based automatisms, themselves being transformations of instincts into drives via the technical exteriorization of life, founded on these removable organs that are the technical objects that archivize this life, and that are the condition of constitution of what Freud understood as the fetish. Derrida opposes the death drive to the pleasure principle, even though Freud says specifically that the repetition compulsion means that the question of libido is displaced from being just a question of pleasure or discharge. The drive is anarchic, and as such, anarchivistic. And the question of libido is that of the transformation of the drive as automatic into the autonomy of desire, founded on the composition of the death drive with the drive-based automatic counter-tendency that is a life drive, and the drive of vital reproduction. Desire is thus what arranges technical reproduction and vital reproduction as two automatisms, the composition of which is autonomous. The automatic process that is life, and in particular life endowed with a sexuated nervous system and a neocortex, unlike snails or slugs, leads through a transformation of these automatisms into a conquest of autonomy. It leads, in other words, to a leap into what Simonon called psychic and collective individuation. In the context in which I am attempting to think the question of autonomy, which is also the question of automatization characteristic of contemporary society, what hangs over the whole thing is the hyper-toxic reality of the automatic superego, that is, the disinternalization of the law, and the foundation itself automatic. A law applies itself as a necessity and to everyone, even if reinterpreting by a judge or jury of citizens, it continuously puts back into question and transforms its automaticity through jurisprudence, which is a process of disautomatization. Today, automatization has reached very deep levels where neuronal automatisms, that is the biological foundations of the drives, are arranged with the industrial automatisms that emerge from the process of grammatization, of technical and mechanical reproducibility, of formalization, and of the digital treatment in which archivization in lifetime consists, short-circuiting the anamnesic circuits acquired through paideia and situated in the neocortex. These industrial automatisms systematically solicit the archaic neuronal automatisms of the reptilian brain and establish as a permanent threat an automatization in the service of the autonomization of techniques, such as Friedrich Kittler has long anticipated, rather than in the service of noetic autonomy. Such an automatization attempts to subject noetic souls to an adaptative process short-circuiting the process of adoption in which the internalization of the superego consists. This is why, taking up an expression from Marcuse, I call the automatization of the superego. In Beyond the Pelagian Principle, Freud attempted to think from 1920 onwards both the automatic status of the drives insofar as they contradict each other and the way in which this contradiction elevates them and synthesizes them to a dialogic of desire and libido that causes them to move from the anarchive of the drives to the archive of libido by propping themselves up not just on the drives, but on this constitutive crutch of the psychic apparatus, that is, the archive insofar as tertiary retention enables the transformation of the drives into an object investment. This archive is, this archive that is tertiary retention, however, and the possibility of transforming the drive into object investment appears in Freud long before he thinks the drive as such. In 1995, then in his theory of sexuality, that is, at the point when he becomes interested in fetishism. The question of the fetish is that of tertiary retention, which the proto-thinking is an exteriorization of the drive that such that finding itself between two beings who are themselves drive-based enables them to share the exteriorization of their drive. Okay, it's 12. No, it is finished. It's not 12, but it is 1 hour and 5 minutes. What is a digital, if not a form of writing? Digital is writing that can be inscribed and read by automata, scanned, as one says, at speed of light. It is an essentially automatic writing and reading, in relation to which we should ask what it would have meant, not just for psychoanalysis, but also for surrealism, in the soul of André Breton, his psychic apparatus had been supported by a digital brain, by a digital cerebral organ. I pose this question in order to state, in conclusion, the heart of my argument, namely that the noetic brain, the central organ of the psychosomatic noetic body, is essentially the organ capable of acquiring automatisms and of gaining something like autonomy, which in Plato is called anamnesis, the latter constituting the capacity of think for oneself. The capacity to think for oneself, not in the sense that I would know the origin of knowledge, but in the sense that I only ever know by going back over each time the origin of all the knowledge that has always already preceded me, just as Dasein is always already preceded by its past. Thank you very much.